It had only recently occurred to me how nostalgically attached I am to Pokemon the first movie. I mean, I always had it on DVD, but as far as nostalgic movies from my childhood go, I always thought of, The Iron Giant, Toy Story 2, Tarzan, but then I heard that they were making a CG remake of Pokemon the first movie. So I watched it again and I realized, holy crap, this is like a super nostalgic movie for me. Every bit as nostalgic as the ones I just listed. So when I heard they were doing a CG remake of it, I was like, alright, I'm watching it. It's not a choice for me at that point. Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. That is quite the long title. So Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution, like I said, is a CG remake of Pokemon the first movie, Mewtwo Strikes Back. And it's on Netflix, so you can watch it right now whenever you want. If you have Netflix. If you remember the first movie, the premise is exactly the same. Mewtwo was genetically created by scientists from a fossil of Mew, the rarest and most ancient of Pokemon. So now Mewtwo claims to be the strongest Pokemon in the world. He has a god complex, so he challenges the strongest trainers in the world, including Ash and his friends, and he's got his evil scheme to take over the world. Literally the same thing as the first movie. Now it's just a CG version of it. So how is it? Well, look, it's a remake. It's a remake of a movie I am really nostalgically attached to, so automatically it's not gonna be as good. I mean, I will say the animation is pretty good. I like seeing the world of Pokemon realized in a 3D medium. I mean, this is not the first time this has ever happened in Pokemon, but it is for the anime anyway. Yeah, I watched the show when I was a kid, and I watched a few of the movies. I actually watched a lot of the movies well into my teenage years. Yeah, I watched Jirachi Wishmaker, Destiny Deoxys. I love The Rise of Darkrai. The point is, yeah, they're all hand-drawn. Now we have a Pokemon movie that's all CGI, and it does look pretty good. The Pokemon in this movie, they look better in CGI than they do in that Detective Pikachu movie. Like, I'll look at some of the Pokemon in this movie and be like, yeah, those are CG Pokemon. That's how you do it. Make them look like how they look in the show and in the games. You don't have to make them look realistic. They look good here. And seeing Ash and Pikachu, you get that bond that Ash and Pikachu have. It's in this movie. It felt good to see. But as I was watching this movie, I couldn't help but notice that it copies the original like verbatim. Every scene, beat for beat. The pacing is exactly the same, which I'm not gonna lie, I appreciated that. A lot of times in remakes these days, yeah, I'm talking about the live action Disney ones, the pacing is very different. It's usually slower and the lines aren't said with as much emotion as they were in the original, so they just feel flat. This remake didn't feel flat because it followed the same beats as the original. However, when it comes to the dialogue in this movie, I noticed that a lot of the lines are different, but when I say different, here's what I mean. This is when I realized I was watching this movie, I was like, holy crap, I really am nostalgically attached to the first movie. Because I was watching this new one and I was remembering lines from the original movie as I was watching this. I was like, yep, here's where he says this, and this is where this line comes up. Oh, I love that line. But the lines the characters speak in this movie, it's like the script used a thesaurus or something. It gets the same point across that the first movie did, just says it differently. Example, in the first movie where Brock goes up to the Nurse Joy poster and he's like, she's cute. In this movie, he goes up to the poster and he says, she's pretty. It's like that, but for most of the lines in this movie. And I realized that a lot of the lines in this movie don't really get the emotion and point across as they did in the original. I didn't feel that same impact. Here's another example. In the first movie, when all the trainers are gathered and Ash is meeting everyone's Pokemon, that one guy has a Gyarados, and Ash is like, wow, I heard it takes a lot of skill to train Gyarados. That got the point across that, yeah, Gyarados is a big, monstrous Pokemon, who is awesome, by the way, and that, yeah, it takes a lot of skill to train one. In this movie, when Ash meets the guy's Gyarados, he goes, wow, isn't Gyarados known as the atrocious Pokemon? And I was like, yeah, that's what it says in the Pokédex. That doesn't get the point across that it's a big, huge Pokemon that takes a lot of skill to train. And stuff like that happens a lot in this movie. But then I read that the script in this movie, the English version anyway, was retranslated to be closer to the Japanese version scripts. I read that on Bulbapedia and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But in my opinion, that's not the way to go. Because yeah, the English dialogue in this film is closer to the Japanese version scripts, sure. But the English language and the Japanese language, they're different. Not just in that they sound different, but they're phrased differently. People talk in different ways in different languages. When you're watching an anime, it's always the battle of dub versus sub. The English dub versus the Japanese dub with English subtitles. And a lot of the time, yeah, the sub is usually better. It's Japanese, it's legit, and you're watching with English subtitles, which ultimately means you have to read the movie or the show or whatever you're watching. In this case, though, I think the English dub is better, at least in the original anyway. The original Pokemon the first movie, I assume the dub is better. I assume that because I haven't seen the Japanese version of the first movie. This new remake, you can watch in Japanese. It's an option on Netflix, which I really appreciate, by the way. So you can watch this new one in Japanese, and you'll notice that the mouth synchronization, it fits with the Japanese, not the English. I did watch this remake twice. First time in English, second time in Japanese. And when I was watching it in English, I noticed that, they're mouthing their lines, and it didn't line up with what they were saying in English. Watched it in Japanese, it lined up pretty perfect. perfectly. It does make you think of, yeah, a lot of anime is hand-drawn, and their mouths move, it's always like very basic mouth movements, so you can translate it to any language you want, really, and the mouth movements should more or less line up. In this CG remake, you don't have that luxury, so it's different. So if stuff like that bothers you, then you should probably watch this movie in Japanese. Because when I watched it in English, I was like, this isn't coming across really well, because the lines that are closer to the Japanese version, but just in English, they're not having the same emotional impact on me that the first movie did, and it dragged the movie down for me. But then watching it in Japanese, I appreciated it a lot more, I'm not gonna lie. I was watching the movie I know from my childhood, just in a different language. Do that, you can just turn off the subtitles and replace the lines they're saying with the lines you know in your head from the first movie. That is, if you're nostalgically attached to it like I am. And it makes this remake a lot better. And watching this plot unfold, you can't help but just be hit with the nostalgia wave. Which, yeah, alright, I'll clear this up. I am a 90s kid. I was born in 1995. Pokemon the first movie came out in 1998. So I was a young tyke just starting to get into Pokemon, and many years later this movie has stuck around with me. But I mean, you watch this movie now and you're like, yeah, there are some definitely dated 90s things in that movie. Like when all the Pokemon are fighting each other, all the originals versus the clones, there's that 90s song that's playing in the background. Brother, my brother. You're like, oh yeah, it's the 90s. So for both versions of this movie, I'll actually say, if you're not a 90s kid who grew up on Pokemon, you're not gonna like it as much. This CG remake came out at a really good time because it knows that there are a lot of kids out there who grew up on Pokemon in the 90s, so we're just gonna hit them with a nostalgia bomb. And in that aspect anyway, this new remake really works, because I couldn't help but just be hit with like, boom, nostalgia, oh my god, that's my childhood. Except in this movie, when all the Pokemon are fighting each other, the originals and the clones, there's no 90s song that plays. Not in this one. It uses original score. Which I will say, even the score in the original had memorable themes that I remember to this day. Mewtwo's theme, dun 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 dun. This new movie does away with all those themes, comes up with new ones that I'm just not gonna remember, and that's just a fact. I will say though, alright, I'm gonna give you a little spoiler warning right here. If you've not seen the first movie, then I'm flattered that you're watching this video, but you've been warned. So, the sad scene. You know the scene I'm talking about, where Ash turns to stone? He's lying there, frozen, petrified on the ground, Pikachu's crying. It's a good scene, it's impactful, but in this remake, holy god. When it comes up to that scene in this remake, I thought it did it actually better. Again, it's probably because of the animation, it's cleaner. The sad expression on Pikachu's face when he starts crying, and the way Pikachu is just crying and yelling throughout this whole scene, I was actually tearing up. I'm not gonna lie, I was tearing up. The original didn't make me tear up. This version did. Just because I felt it was more emotionally impactful because the animation technology is newer, it's cleaner, it's more pristine, more easily able to convey the emotion you're supposed to be feeling right now. So when Ash gets brought back, you're like, holy god, that was an emotional ride. So good on this movie for nailing that scene. I just had to mention that. In the end, Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution is alright. It's better in Japanese than it is in English, but honestly, I don't know if I'm gonna watch it again. If I want to watch the first movie, then I'll just watch the first movie. And that does get me thinking. The million-dollar question is, when are remakes necessary? Because if the original is fine as it is and it still holds up today, like the first movie does, then ultimately a remake is not necessary. However, when the original movie does not hold up to today, for example, Frankenstein. I watched the original Frankenstein not too long ago, and it's good, but it doesn't hold up because it's really old, it's really dated, it's in black and white, the editing and the pacing is just different. I was watching it and I was like, I see all the potential in the world for a good, new, serious remake. Tell the story of Frankenstein, but just make it new, modern, draw out the emotion, draw out the scariness. It could be really, really good, a new modern retelling of Frankenstein. In that case, I feel like, yeah, a remake would be absolutely necessary. So with that question of whether a remake is necessary or not in your head, I find this new remake of Pokemon the first movie ultimately unnecessary. But still fine, not the worst remake I've ever seen. It's better than all those live action Disney remakes. But that's just my opinion. I don't feel the need to watch this CG remake again, but if you want to, then by all means go for it. So Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. Have you watched it? What did you think about it? Have you seen the first movie? Are you nostalgically attached to that like I am? What's your favorite Pokemon movie? Or here's a good question, who's your favorite Pokemon? Mine? I love Kyogre because killer whales are my favorite animal, so it makes sense. But whatever you think, go ahead and leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe.